That's a good point. And you kind of spoke on solutions, right? You alluded to solutions. I'm sure we'll get to that at some point. But then there's like, it's a two-prong approach. So you have the spiritual side of what you were kind of speaking on, right? Where it's the lack of love and respect. And then there's like the practical side. Like right now, we have like the Second Amendment where it's protecting our right to bear arms. Then you have gun policies. When you think of states like California that have strict gun policies, and then it kind of reflects in their gun violence rate, whereas it's not as high. But that's not always the case because then you have some states like Colorado where they have stricter gun policies in place, but then their crime rate doesn't reflect it. They still have a high crime rate. And so I think what question, comes up with that, we can do our own part outside of lack of love and respect, looking for the government to enact policies that kind of restrict some of the rights. But does God hold men accountable, so to speak, or does he look rather more so at the individual?
Yes, men will be held accountable, but also he gives men the ability and authority to hold themselves accountable. And when it comes down to men holding themselves accountable, whether it be gun violence, whether it be personal disciplines in life, that all depends on the man himself. And from that reference standpoint, that's got a lot to do, again, going back to the foundation of things. If a man doesn't have a proper foundation to life and the proper education to do that, then he's incompetent to be able to make those different choices. In other words, to hold himself accountable.
Yeah, so that responsibility is more so on the individual. It's not the government. Obviously, the government is there to help enhance, but end of the day, God's holding each man accountable, specifically the individual.
That's right. Well, and not only that, God holds the government responsible for putting the proper laws in place, and then he holds man accountable for complying with the laws that are in land that are in place. And so that begs the differ. Every adult individual has to be personally accountable and responsible. But then if we look at that aspect, and that's from a carnal perspective, from the natural man, that still all ties back to his foundation. Because if he didn't have the proper foundation, he can't really hold himself accountable because he's never been taught how to be responsible or to use discretion or to make proper choices in life.
Mhm.
So that root cause all goes back to the important nucleus of the family. And that'll take us in a whole other direction into the spiritual realm of things. And we can talk about from the physical and the natural man perspective, but it's all going to still be rooted right back. It's going to go all the way back to that foundation. And
Yeah.
it's going to go all the way back to godly principles and the love and respect of man. So we can build, if you don't have the proper foundation, the spiritual foundation, the scriptural foundation, it'll just be like building housing on the wrong material. Nobody would build a house on sand because it's too shifty, it sinks and it moves too much. So even building a house, that's why you got to build your house on the proper foundation, and that starts all the way on the ground there. Everything has to be squared up. It has to have the proper brick and mortar, and all the framing has to be squared up. Because if it's not squared up, guess what? If you're building on a crooked foundation or a crooked frame, everything you attach to it is going to be crooked and lopsided.
Yeah. Yeah,
And,
that's a good point.
and that's how critical a spiritual foundation is.
Mhm.
Spirit has to do with the inside of man. In other words, it's got to deal with the heart of man, and that's the foundation of things. Because everything what's in the man's heart, that's going to dictate whether he obeys the government laws that are in place, whether he obeys even the natural laws of life. It has everything to do with that because out of man's heart flows the issues of life. That's going to dictate how he thinks. And if he dictates how he thinks, that's tied directly also to the level of violence and how fast it accelerates. Because again, going back to the foundation, if mom and daddy hasn't taught the child how to respect his brothers and sisters, and see, that's all directly tied spiritually, but it's also a physical. We take this out into the physical world, the things that have been taught to us from the foundation of our upbringing. At home, when you got a mom and dad that teach children how to respect one another and how to love one another, like I did you guys, not to fight one another, respect each other's privacy space. You remember how I used to do when I would say when one was sick, I would make everybody else be quiet and yield to them so that they can rest in peace. All those things are good foundational principles, and that spreads outside of the house, the foundation which has been laid. So then that carries out into society, and that generates love and respect for a fellow man. So then it's not likely that you'll go for those from those foundational principles to going out to just gun a man down in the street or to just sexually assault a female or disrespect anybody because of the foundation that was laid. It's just like going back to the house. If the house is squared up, when you get to the second floor, guess what? It's easy for everything to be squared up because you squared up off the foundation. So you see how that spills over. They directly tied together. I know we have laws separating church and state, but you can't think about this for a minute. You can't separate your spirit from your body. If you do that, what's going to happen? You die. And so this is in a sense what we did. We separate God's law, church and state. We separate biblical principles. We separate that too, but yet our whole world depends on that. And so still when still people don't gravitate to laying a spiritual foundation, there's still hope because education can still make up for some of the lack of the spiritual foundation. Because you have people, quote unquote, morally upstanding people because they've been well educated and they've been taught some things by their parents. But where the real foundation comes in is when God is in the individual's heart and he forms that foundation, that spiritual foundation, that gives the extra strength to make sure that it's carried out through and through. And then even in that, that takes a lot of education.
Yeah, and you mentioned foundational. It seems like some of the problems are inevitable. If you think about it, we're like encased in this sinful structure that we're
Hmm.
in, right? We're born in sin. It seems
Hmm.
like it's just going to be an uphill battle, especially for young men or boys, men, women, people of all sorts. And so, like I said, I think you're kind of alluding to the fact that you have to be tied somewhere, and maybe that's where that spiritual link kind of comes into place because we are encased in this structure that we're bound to make some mistakes.
No doubt about it. But that's where the right biblical and the spiritual foundation comes in because that can help us. That helps us to compensate for the battle that we in. In other words, we live in this flesh that wants to rule the spirit. In other words, it wants to be in charge. And that's where we get our spiritual training, our strength from God, from that biblical education, because then we learn how God's spirit works in us from the inside to give us the strength to overcome these battles. Because as long as you live in this flesh, you're going to always have to contend. You're going to have to contend and fight for that. Because you think about the way our desires want to take over, which is another term for our flesh. We want to eat too much. We want more and more sex. We want more and more money. We want more and more power. We want more and more possession. You see what I'm saying? Where does it end? If there's no restraint, where does it end? So likewise, also with the violence, same principle applies. If I don't have no spiritual background, guess what? My heart will become harder and harder. I will become meaner and meaner. I will become tougher and tougher. And then the culture, bring that back into play. Then our culture feeds that every day. We have 130 channels on TV. And what does that? It's more powerful or just as powerful as advertisement. Out of sight, out of mind. You look at what you feed yourself from the culture. That's what becomes stronger, and that's what fuels the fire that's already within us. Our sports world, everything is so competitive. Education is so competitive. Everything in life we kind of compete for. We want to go for entertainment. We go to the ball stadiums. We want to get to the front of the line. We want to be first. We want to push and shove. Matter of fact, the reason why the foundation is so important, it starts out at the earliest of stages with children in the daycare. You notice they start to fight over a ball, they fight over a book, they fight over a blanket, they fight over a toy, a book, but anything. That's the human fallen nature. That's why the foundation is so important. That goes back to why parenting is so important because you can unravel a lot of that stuff before it takes hold when you get the proper foundation and the proper upbringing. And from scriptural standpoint, that goes back to education. It takes a secular education and it takes a biblical education so that you can have a half a chance to stand. Having said all that, I'll dive all the way in. Simply put, need God's help because that's the whole purpose of the Bible. That's the whole purpose of the scriptures. Because we all born as little babies, born here not knowing anything, but all these are learned behaviors. Even going unchecked without the foundation, all these behaviors are learned. And then when a young man or a young woman gets up to the age where, okay, the adult age, they say when they reach 18, and nothing has been checked, nothing has been put in place, no foundation has been laid. So then we complete our 12 years of schooling, and all through all that, we've been influenced by different companies and different people who have come up with from different backgrounds. All that has to do with shaping the culture in which you live in. So if you don't have the proper educational foundation and you don't have the proper biblical foundation, guess what? Then you're going to be influenced by this violent culture that we're born into. So then that takes us back to show us really just how important the foundation is laid from the family when the child is born unto the two parents that the child is born to. Now, when you look at it from that side, you can't help the parents that you're born to. But we can see all parents come out of different households. All people parent differently. Well, what's the guideline? Is there a guideline? Or do we make our own guidelines? Well, what happens is when you don't take it from a biblical perspective, that's what everybody does. They make their own ground rules. They make their own foundations the way they want it, and they build on whatever foundation they want to build on. And then, therefore, that complicates things 1,000 times over because if everybody goes their own way and does it the way they want to do, born into this culture, violence is going to grow because
It's inevitable.
it's
It's
inevitable.
yeah, because if you think about it, God gave us dominion
Everything.
over everything, right? And so he gave us free will. So if you have over, 350 million people, and they all have their own free will, free choice, and you have always want to do what they want to do. So I think you're always going to have that inclination of
Well, it's in that nature. It's in the sinful nature. But here's where the biblical foundation come in at. That's how God helps us with that through the instruction from His Word, so that we won't bite and devour one another, and yet still can exercise our free will and have the discretion to have some restraints. And everybody has to have that. Other than that, if every man doesn't have any kind of restraints and everybody just continue doing it, it's going to be some assaults because it's going to be some clashing. And you know what happened with that? People start throwing hands after that. And when
yeah.
somebody starts throwing hands, man's ego get in the way. Then they don't want to lose. So then that's where our assaults come in, and that's where our gun violence come in. And so what's the remedy?
Well, again, I think that's multifaceted as well.
That's a wide range of discussions that we have to have. Now, does the government, like some governments, should the government take a better proactive role and pass some laws? Well, when you think about the amendment to right to bear arms, do they change that? Would that change the gun violence? Do you think?
No, not
Well,
necessarily.
because it'll cause more people to obtain guns illegally.
Yeah, that, and you would probably see an influx if that ever was talked about. People would
Well,
probably start going buying guns now.
well, that's what they did when they even started talking about it. Gun sales went up drastically, ammunition
Yeah.
sales drastically, and then not only that, it created a bigger black market. So again, goes back to letting us know how important education is, spiritual and secular. And the thing is, from biblical perspective, it lets us know that we are the wiser and weaker generation. We have wisdom universities everywhere. That educates us to be successful in life, but if we're not getting any spiritual education, which is to help the inner man, then we're still like that lopsided foundation. We're one sided. You can have all the degrees that you want in the world. I mean, graduate from 6 universities, but if there's no spiritual balance, still off kilter.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, I don't think the Second Amendment should be,
No, it shouldn't be
I
changed.
think it's needed. Yeah, it's obviously
Oh,
needed
definitely.
because we wouldn't be where we're at now, especially
That's
with all the
right.
wars we
Right.
had.
You're right. And then without that, there'll probably even be more assaults. And the nature of man, even if it wasn't the right to bear arms, we're gonna bear something.
I was gonna say we're gonna, caveman days are gonna pick up a club, right?
But that's what I said, we're gonna bear a knife. We can create some weapons. Grab one another by the hair or the ear, you something, because that's inherently in each of us. We all have that capability in us.